Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of the Fifth Child Podcast, the weekly podcast where me, your podcaster Chris, will give you two different recommendations either for video games, movies, entertainment, anime, or the like. So, like I said in the previous couple episodes of the podcast, these next few episodes of the podcast, kind of for the next month or so, are going to be shorter podcasts, but therefore they're going to be a little bit more focused. They're just going to be focused on whatever two recommendations that I have set out for you guys. That's mainly because, one, I'm getting a little bit more busy with work, unfortunately, and two, I'm also preparing because there is going to likely be an episode in the future where it's going to be one huge podcast just dedicated to Fire Emblem The Three Houses. Honestly, a couple of these episodes are going to be recorded in bulk. So once we get to that the Fire Emblem episode, there is likely going to be a little bit of overlap where a couple of the episodes airing after the Three Houses episode will likely actually probably be recorded before then. So I hope that that's not going to be too distracting. I just want to make sure to dedicate as much as I can to talking about Fire Emblem, because I'm going to have a lot to talk about in the couple weeks I'll be playing it, and I'm not going to be able to play much else during that time. So again, like I've said in all these different podcast episodes, if you like what you see here and you want to see more, just like, comment, subscribe. If you want to support this channel even further and help it grow more, always go to the Patreon and down in the description below. And if you want to give any amount during the month, on a monthly basis, anything will likely help out. I just want to make sure that if there is an interest to make this channel grow even more, I want to be able to have that resource and time to be able to get that, and anything in that Patreon will help get this channel much further along in terms of its growth. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into the two recommendations, because again, like I said, this is going to be some shorter episodes, so I want to make sure they're nice and focused, and just focused on the two recommendations. So I have two different recommendations for you guys in this episode. I've got an anime and I have a video game. I'm going to go ahead and talk about the anime first, actually. The anime for today's podcast episode is going to be Made in Abyss. Made in Abyss is an anime by Kinema Citrus, the same exact animation studio that animated The Rising of the Shield Hero. This was actually made before Rising of Shield Hero. Made in Abyss was aired during the summer of 2017, during July, all the way from July to September. It's currently licensed by Sentai Filmworks. They have made a dub of it. You can get that dub you can buy that dub by Sentai Filmworks. It's actually it's relatively cheap. I actually just recently ordered it myself from Amazon for only $30. It's a 13-episode series, so that's a little bit much for just a 13-episode series, but let me say it's absolutely worth it. If you want to stream it legally, if you have Verve, the High Dive channel on Verve has all 13 episodes in English and Japanese subtitled. If you have Amazon Prime Video, you can stream the series there, but it's only in Japanese, if you're okay with that. So let's go ahead and jump into the major specs of this series. I'm going to go ahead and talk about the story. So the story of Made in Abyss takes place in this kind of mining colony that's surrounding this thing called the Abyss. A huge, gigantic chasm in the middle of the earth that's filled with ancient relics from an ancient past, different creatures that kind of roam around it, either dangerous or not so dangerous, and no one really knows what lies at the bottom besides a few certain elite people known as divers. The community around the Abyss is populated by a certain school and a certain community of divers or miners, who are basically taught from a young age to survive up on the surface, while also trying to go into the abyss and discover what is underneath it. And the story is mainly focused on two different characters. The main character of the story is a girl named Riko. Riko is the daughter of an elite diver known as Liza, who's called a White Whistle This diving community has a different tier of the kind of divers, and the highest tier possible is a white whistle. Liza has been missing for a long time because she has been in some of the furthest levels of the abyss. And Riko herself is a red whistle, one of the lower tiers since how relatively young she is. A lot of the characters that we see in the diving school are all in their young preteen, or all in their mid to late preteens. Riko herself is only 12 or so years old. And during her adventure, and during the first episode or so, she comes across a young boy who's part android, kind of. He's got a little robotic arm, known as Reg. He seems like a pretty normal young boy, except for the fact that he has a little mechanical arm. And so Reg and Riko become good friends, and then they decide that they want to go into the abyss itself and see what kind of mysteries lie down there, and while also trying to find out more about what happened to Riko's mother, because Riko's past herself is a little bit of a mystery too. Without going into any more specifics, that's the general story that I will say. This is, like I said, this is a 13-episode-long series, and the series itself is just based around Riko and Reg's adventure as they go further down the abyss, and all the different creatures and people that they meet down there who also live in the abyss. So the series has a lighter-looking tone to it. A lot of this is going to overlap into the animation and art style. If you look at the art style animation of it, it has a very, very cute art style. All the characters look like very young children. All the characters are young children who look like young children, and it has kind of an almost chippy-like art style, a miniaturized art style to it. And the overall tone of the series is incredibly lighthearted at first. The lighthearted tone of the series does great for showing a very, very hopeful kind of tone for it. It does a very good job at giving you a hopeful tone for the series. It has a bit of a childlike wonder to it that is really, really sort of charming. The series knows exactly when to have fun with itself and have fun and give you a very strong and adventurous tone. It has a good, fun, lighthearted kind of tone to it that also has a very, very adventurous feel to it. It also has a bit of a deeper, thrilling aspect to it as well. As Reg and Riko go on their adventures and they go further down into the abyss, a harsh reality will start to encompass their adventures. And this is where the series starts off very, very lighthearted and then slowly starts to dip itself into darkness. The chibi art style is very deliberate. The chibi art style is able to give off this tone of having a bit of a lightheartedness to the adventures that Riko and Reg have, while also having this very underlining tone of dark, harsh reality to it. There's a great chemistry between both Riko and Reg as we go into a little bit more of the characters. The main two characters, like I said, were Riko and Reg, and they have a great chemistry to them. Riko is very, very outgoing. She's very energetic, while Reg is a little bit downtrodden, very shy, but also has a little bit of a mystery to him that you slowly begin to unlock as the series goes on. There's more characters that they run into. For example, they run into an ancient dweller known as Ozin, who kind of looks like a young witch, but who's actually been around for goodness knows how long. And the introduction of Ozin is definitely the point in the series when the characters themselves start hitting these trials and start realizing the harsh reality that's down there for them in the abyss. As Ozin tests them in order to find out whether or not they are really worthy to survive the abyss. And this is the first time, and this is around the 5th or 6th episode or so when this happens. This is the first time in the series when the main characters are tested, and they're hurt and they are beaten. And it definitely shows that not even the main characters themselves have any sort of plot armor, regardless of whether or not that they are the main characters or if they're just 12-year-old kids. there is a darkness to this series that will really, really take the viewer off guard. It took me off guard as well. And I knew for a fact that going into the series that it had a dark underlining tone to it, and I didn't really know exactly what was going to happen. So every single time a darker, harsh reality would confront Reg and Rico, I was taken off guard that the series would go into these kinds of depths. So I don't want to spoil anything else for the story as well. I will say that as far as the story is concerned, if you're looking for that fun, lighthearted adventure, you're going to find it. But if you're looking for something dark, if you're looking for some darker undertones to it that slowly develop as the series goes on, then this is certainly for you. Let's go ahead and go into the sound and music. So just like Kinema Citrus's later animated production, The Rising of Shield Hero, Made in Abyss is composed by Kevin Penkins, who does another fantastic job with the Made in the Abyss soundtrack. The overall tone of the soundtrack has a very, very kind of folk-like tone to it. There's not a lot of really bombastic orchestral pieces. There's not a lot of heroic themes to it. This isn't like this isn't your ordinary shonen kind of series. This has a very, very moody atmosphere to it. And a couple of the great tracks in the series, such as Tomorrow or Hanavesa Karahina, these all have very, very folk-like atmospheric, moody tones to it. And particularly, one of the first sequences in the first episode has Hana Seva Gardina playing near the very end of it, and it has and it's basically an insert song where there's a guest singer kind of singing in the background, and it certainly sets the tone for the series. And it gives you a sense of wonder for this. It gives you a sense of wonder at the visuals that you're seeing, which we'll get to visuals in a second. And more or less just kind of foreshadows how kind of moody the series will get as it goes along. The animation and the overall animation and art style for the series is fantastic too. Kinema Citrus did a great job with The Rising of Shield Hero, but they're able to do so much more with this series. For a 2017 series and only having 13 episodes in it, there's a lot of time devoted to the animation, and at times this is Studio Ghibli level quality of fluid animation. Just in the first episode alone, when Rico and Reg are surveying the opening of the abyss and the sunrise that looms over it, how fluid, how detailed the outside of the abyss looks like. It's wonderful to behold. And so that kind of brings us into the enjoyment of this overall series and how much I enjoyed it. This series is definitely probably one of the best series to come out in the last 5 or so years. It's a very, very dark series as it goes around. So you have to make sure you're in the tone you have to make sure you're in the right mindset for this kind of series. If you're not prepared, if you are honestly not prepared for how dark the series might get, it will take you by surprise. The series has an escalating tone to it where it does start lighthearted and then it goes darker and darker and darker. But at the same time, it still has that lighter tone to it that helps keep it anchored in. It does tend to get a little bit overbearing sometimes. And honestly, when I got done with the series, even though that there was a definite bittersweet ending to it, and I wanted more of it, I definitely kind of left the series feeling a little bit downtrodden, slightly depressed, because there are some really dark, depressing subject matter in the last 3 or so episodes of the series that can get kind of overwhelming. So just be prepared for that when you're going into it. But if you are prepared for it, then you will find one of the darkest, most mature anime that you will find in a long, long time. And for only 13 or so episodes, it's a very fast watch. It takes a little bit to get going until it figures out exactly where it's going. And honestly, the only flaw I can see with the series is that it's not done yet. The series is based on an ongoing manga. I forgot the name of the author. I can look that up while I'm talking about this. But the manga series itself is still ongoing. At least I think so. and thus far we have not had a season 2 or a continuation for the series. As far as I know, though, we are getting a sequel movie, which is going to be released in early 2020. So hopefully it's going to be great to see more of this. Here we go. The series is still ongoing. It's only 8 volumes long. And it was written by Akihito Tsukishi. And it's a seinen series that's actually a web comic. So that explains why it's actually not been... That does explain why it hasn't been animated, because there's actually not a lot to animate so far, since it's kind of a shorter series. So hopefully we'll get to see more. Hopefully we'll get to see more of it very soon. Hopefully, if this sequel anime film does well enough, we could hopefully get a longer season 2, where we do get an overall scope for what the overarching plotline is. Because for the most part, this first season takes a smaller plotline, but treats it as if it's a much bigger one. And that's as much of a big praise as that's a big praise I can say for the series, as well as being kind of a detriment, because we don't know exactly what the overarching story is until the rest of it gets animated. So with that, I'm going to give Made in the Abyss a huge recommendation. Again, if you're looking for a good, fun, lighthearted adventure, you're going to find it here. But if you're also looking for a darker, more mature kind of series, you're definitely going to find it in this. So I give it a huge recommendation. So we're going to go ahead and switch gears, and we're going to go ahead and talk about the video game for today. The video game that we're going to be talking about today is Wargroove, by the developer Chucklefish, who are also the publishers of Stardew Valley, the Harvest Moon ripoff / homage. Wargroove, excuse me, is a turn-based tactical video game that is heavily based on the Advanced Wars by the Advanced Wars series that started out on the Game Boy Advance. Now, I never actually played the Advanced Wars all the way through. Out of all of the Game Boy Advance games I played, and there are a lot of them, the one video game system I had the largest library for back in the day was my Game Boy Advance. I had pretty much every single major first-party Nintendo title for the Game Boy Advance, yet surprisingly, Advanced Wars skipped my notice. So Wargroove has been released for the Nintendo Switch, Steam and Windows, and the Xbox One, and we are eventually going to be getting a PlayStation 4 version sometime down the road. So Wargroove is developed by Chucklefish. It's a very, very, very small studio, and it was released actually this year, in February. I recently picked up the game when it was on sale about a month ago, and I finished the game in about a couple weeks. So the overall story of Wargroove. Wargroove is a fantasy series that takes place in this continent called Arania. So Arania has two different kingdoms, has had two different kingdoms that have constantly been at war with each other, known as Silmar and Cacophony. So there's been this huge war that's been going on for the longest time, and stuck in the middle of it has been the Cherrystone Kingdom, which is where our main characters are based off, which is where our main characters are based off of. So the king of Cherrystone, King Merciful II, is killed by a vampire known as Sigrid from the kingdom of Velheim. And so the daughter of Merciful, Mercia, is then made king, and then has to deal with the incoming invasion by the Felheim Legion. The Legion is able to overwhelm Cherrystone, and the Lord of Velheim, Valder, is able to drive Queen Mercia and her army into retreating. So Mercia, along with her mentor Emmerich, are then forced to seek aid from the surrounding kingdoms in order to fight against Velheim, and also fight against their role in terms of catching and trying to stop their overall plot of trying to gain this ultimate weapon known as the Requiem, which could ultimately end the war, and not a fortuitous manner for the rest of Arania. So the story of Wargroove is really nothing special. It's just a fantasy story about wars going on. There's no deep politics going on whatsoever with this story. This is the kind of story that honestly just gets the job done, and it's more or less a backdrop for the gameplay. All the characters are really kind of fun and enjoyable. The characters themselves, Queen Mersha herself is a fun main character, and then you do get to run into all of the other commanding officers and from the other kingdoms as well, such as oh gosh, I'm trying to remember all of them, such as like Tenri, gosh, I'm drawing a blank. I'm drawing a blank on all the other commanding officers. Emmerich, Tenri. Gosh, I forget all the other ones. I'll have to look those up later while I'm doing this. Ragna. Every single character has their own specific kind of personality, and they do stand out from one another. But they're very, very baseline. So honestly, the story itself is nothing really special whatsoever. What is special is the overall gameplay and the concept of it. So Wargroove is a tactical RPG. It's based more or less on the kind of gameplay system that Advanced Wars has. And the overall gameplay of Advanced Wars was a tactical RPG with a tile-based system of progression. You can kind of think of it as a very detailed version of chess. I wouldn't say more complex than chess. More detailed, more numbers-based. Chess is way more complex than most tactical RPGs anyways. I'm not going to belittle chess whatsoever just because they put numbers on a tactical RPG. So the main goal of Wargroove is that you have a map that's tile-based, you have your side, and then you have your enemy side, and the general goal of what you're trying to do is just trying to complete a certain objective. It depends on what the mission is, but the most common objective is either defeating the enemy's commanding officer or taking down their fortress. And the way you do this is that you start off with a smaller sort of army, and then you have to branch out, you have to capture villages, you have to raise an income, and then you use that income at barracks, and then you use that income at barracks or towers or docks in order to create your land units, your air units, and your sea units. And the more units that you have, the more chances you have at not only defending your fortress, but also taking more enemy villages, and then eventually taking down their commanding officer and their fortress. So the game is different than most tactical RPGs. You do not have a level progression system. There's no experience. So this is more similar to kind of RTSs where you capture territories and then you make your territory bigger in order to raise your income and your finances in order to make your army a lot stronger or a lot more varied. And in terms of the actual combat in the game, it's tile-based, and you have different units you have. You have your soldiers, you have your pikemen, you have your ranged units, you have your horses, you have your air units, you have your sea units, and they all have different form, and they all have different advantages against certain enemy units. They also have different ways to attain critical attacks. So whenever you have certain units placed against another one, if you have a unit that's attacking from one advantage point to down to an enemy that has a lower vantage point, that maximizes the amount of damage output you're able to do. And the health system is a lot more different than some tactical RPGs as well. Enemy units get a lot weaker the less health that they have. So you need to be careful, and you have to be very conscious of how strong your unit is. Because if your unit likely has lower health, they're not going to do much good for you, and at this point they're either just bait for another enemy unit, or you need to pull them out and then heal them if they're a valuable unit that you need to keep their health up. So there's a lot of variation to the combat itself. So let's go ahead and switch gears. So that's the main concept of Wargroove. The music's pretty decent. It's actually a really small soundtrack. And there's generally at least two different kinds. There's two different kinds of themes that go on when you're playing an actual game itself. You have your commanding officer's theme that plays when you play, and then you have the enemy. Excuse me, I have a hiccup. you have your commanding officer's theme, and then you have the enemy commanding officer's theme. And they're all unique to whatever character you're playing as or whatever character your commanding officer is. And they're all pretty good. I definitely think the standout for me would be either Mersha's main theme or Mersha's dog's main theme. So this is a big plus. One of the commanding officers you have is Mersha's dog, Caesar. And he's his own commanding officer, and you get to play as a doggo. So that's a plus. I see that as a win. Other than that, the music's nothing really special since it's kind of a smaller soundtrack. Sound effect wise, gets the job done. In terms of the graphics itself, the game basically looks like a Game Boy Advance Wars game. There's great sprite work though. I think the only problem I have with the graphics is that the character portraits don't look very good whatsoever. There are definitely Game Boy sprite artwork that look much better than Wargroove's, and they kind of make the characters look extremely ugly, particularly Mersha. Mersha's overall art style and, say, box art and gameplay she looks really cool, but in gameplay she kind of looks like a guy, and it's kind of off-putting a little bit, so the art style for the sprites do not do some of the characters very many favors. So that's it for the graphics. So how enjoyable is this game? Very, very enjoyable. There's a lot of depth to this kind of gameplay. Like I was saying in the overall concept of it, you have to be conscious with what you're doing. You have to prioritize exactly what you need to do on every single map and how best you can use your units. You have to know exactly when the right time to set up a certain chokehold on a place in the map, and then maybe use that chokehold as a distraction to send more units outwards. You have to know exactly which units are the best ones to tank. More often than not, you can use your commanding officers to set up a chokehold because they can usually take a hit. Not only that, but the commanding officers have a certain ability that the more attacks that they get in a turn, the more damage they take in. They have a certain ability known as a groove that allows them to help swing the battle in your direction. For example, Mersha, when she uses her groove, has the ability to heal a certain amount of people in her general region. Caesar has the ability to, if there's anyone next to him who has taken a turn, if he uses his groove, they can move again. Emmerich has the ability to put up a little barrier that decreases the damage out, that increases the amount of damage that people can take if they're within that crystal's field of field of view. So there's a lot of different strategies you can use with your commanding officers. If there's a problem I have with the series is that the artificial intelligence of the enemies can get really finicky, especially if you play the game on harder difficulties. That's another great thing about the playability of this game, is that if the game gets a little too hard at the very beginning, which it will get, the game will start off a little bit easy, and then progressively it will get more difficult. And that's because the game is naturally set on the hardest on a harder difficulty. So you can actually scale down the difficulty in such a way that helps you get a feel for how a map is. And then, say if you want to replay that map for a higher rank, you can then increase the difficulty. So that definitely makes the game extremely accessible, and it's why I beat the game pretty quickly. I started the game on the harder difficulty, and then when it got a little bit harder, I lowered the difficulty down to a normal difficulty. And then once you get closer to the end of the game, you realize that the very, very last mission requires you to get higher ranks on every other map in the game. So when I got to that point, I just replayed the other maps on higher difficulties and got better ranks, and then I was able to do the end of the game. So the game is extremely accessible in that regard, and despite the fact that the AI can get really finicky, like for example, in some of the maps, you can play on, at times the AI will change up its routine very, kind of on the fly. For the most part, the AI will always focus on either one of two things. It's either going to focus on your commanding officer or it will focus on your fortress. So the best strategy you can usually think of is using your commanding officer as a tank and then making sure that they're healed up in such a way on a certain chokehold, and then your enemies and then your other units can, say, go after a fortress. On a harder difficulty, the enemy AI will actually change up its strategy along the way, and then that kind of messes up the strategy that usually will mess up the strategy. And this is especially difficult on much bigger maps that have separate chokeholds. It does make the game kind of infuriating somewhere down a little bit further down the line, and it does decrease the amount of fun you have with the game. But like I said, if you're not having as much fun with the game, you can always lower the difficulty. Other things with the game I haven't actually tried out yet. I finished the game like a couple weeks ago, so I haven't really picked it up since. I've been wanting to, but again, I've been playing other games as well. Is that there's a multiplayer aspect to it, where you can actually play online matches with other people, and from what I have heard, this is the most fun part of the game. So if I get the feeling that if I play some multiplayer matches online with some actual living people, I might actually enjoy the game even more. So I'll definitely pick up the multiplayer sometime down the line once I have less and less things to play. Because I definitely enjoyed the main story of the game. There's an arcade mode where you can play as each commanding officer, and actually just play a short little arcade that has 5 different matches with different maps that recycle themselves. It's definitely a good way to get yourself reacquainted with some of the maps and think of all the different strategies that you can use on each map. So I'm going to go ahead and close out this recommendation. Wargroove, I would definitely recommend it if you're a big tactical RPG fan, and if you're looking for something to hold yourself over until Fire Emblem Three Houses came out, which is more or less kind of why I played this game. I definitely think that it's a great replacement. If you love the Advance Wars series, from what I play from the Advance Wars, this is a great replacement for a next sequel for another sequel in the series. So I definitely think you should get it just based on that. So yeah, I think with that's it for today's podcast. Again, there are 2 recommendations that I gave you. 1, the anime Made in Abyss, and 2, the video game Wargroove. You can pick up Wargroove for about 20 or so bucks. It goes on sale every so often, so I was able to pick it up for like $13 on the Switch. So definitely pick it up whenever, if you're feeling a good tactical RPG. So I'm going to go ahead and close out today's podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Again, I'm hoping that you won't get too distracted by the shorter episodes, but I think the payoff is that you are going to get shorter, conciser, more concise and more focused episodes for the time being. So thank you again so much for listening in. Again, if you like what you see here and you want to see more, please like, comment, subscribe, hit the little bell icon if you're using a mobile device. That tells you whenever the new podcast opens up every single Friday. And thank you so much for listening in. If you want to support the channel even further, help it grow more, always feel free to go to the Patreon down in the description below. And anything you have a month would definitely help out and make this channel grow even further. And with that, I will see you guys in the next episode.